I have been in this field for about 17 years in various positions, DSP, program manager, an SSA supervisor, and now the project coordinator for the Ohio Network for Innovation. So really excited to be talking about this subject with everybody. This is the biggest virtual meeting that we've done on this so far. I do know a couple of you actually. You might recognize me from the gathering at the Grove if you've been to that event. I helped to coordinate that as well. But when we get started here, there are a couple of questions that I throw out there. They're not rhetorical, but I know we have a bigger group. But if a couple of you do want to chime in on those questions, it makes it go a little smoother, get a little more interaction. And then before we start, I have a really big ask of everybody with your consent. What I'd love to do is take a quick screenshot of everybody in this meeting. If you're willing to just turn on your camera for about 5 seconds so I can do that and share that with our customers and constituents that we are in fact moving forward and making progress on this, and this is an example, I would love that. We're almost there. Look at that. Perfect, thank you. You can turn your cameras back off if you want now. That was awesome, that was quick action. Thank you, appreciate it. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. All right, you should all see my PowerPoint. If you don't, please speak up and let me know. One second, okay. So we are going to talk about supported decision-making today, but really what I want everybody to understand is that we're just going to provide some context to understand that supported decision-making is something that we all kind of do in our lives naturally. And it's something we do kind of regularly without thinking about it. And once we understand it from that perspective, hopefully it'll make more sense why people with disabilities should also have this as an option in their lives, because they have the exact same rights that we do. So let's start with choices. We all have the right to make choices. It's kind of a basic civil right. So here's that one of those first rhetorical or non-rhetorical questions. Just take a few seconds and think of some of the choices that you've made today. You know, it's about 10 o'clock, so throw out some choices, decisions that you've made just today.
What to have for breakfast?
Yeah, exactly. What to have for breakfast. Anybody else?
What to wear?
Yeah, yeah. And we could keep going, obviously, but you know, what to wear, what to eat, what to drink, whether or not you decided to actually get out of bed to join the meeting, or whether you're still in bed in the meeting. All of those things are choices that we make on a daily basis, right? But now think about some bigger choices that you've made in life. Like, again, a non-rhetorical question. What are some bigger decisions that you've made in your life?
Who to marry?
That's a big one.
Buying a
Or
house.
whether to marry, right?
Yeah, right.
Where
What
to
else?
work?
Yeah, where to work, for sure. Where to live, right? What vehicle we drive, who we spend our time with. All of those pretty big, important decisions that we make. And if we think about all of the decisions that we've made in life, ask yourself this. Have you made those decisions completely independently, or have you sought advice, guidance from other people for some of those, right? People that we trusted, maybe people that have more knowledge than us about a specific subject matter. Sometimes it's just somebody who has a way of explaining something complex in a way that we really understand. And then second, have all of our decisions in retrospect been great decisions, been the best decisions?
Oh, no.
And we'll get to that a little bit more later, because I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we all make mistakes. We all make poor decisions from time to time, some of us more often than others. But then what have we gained from being able to make those decisions, whether they worked out for us or not, right? We gained some really valuable life experience. We learned some of the nuances and the boundaries, parameters in life, so that we can kind of adjust and then move forward with future decisions. So again, whether we like to admit it or not, most of us are not perfect, but we do rely on others to help us make good decisions, even when that decision is ultimately our own to make. So when we ask for help to make decisions, when we seek guidance, generally that's seen as responsible and wise and mature. For people with disabilities, that's not always the case. A lot of times when they need help to make decisions, it's seen as a weakness or a deficiency and something that needs to be fixed. And one of the ways that we often try to fix that is with guardianship, which is a pretty extreme measure. So early on in my career, I was talking to someone who made this analogy that stuck with me because I found it pretty profound. But he said guardianship is like a tattoo. It's relatively easy to get, but once you have it, it's kind of difficult to get rid of. Now, that shouldn't necessarily be the case when you look at the rules that govern probate courts and guardianship. But in practice, that's how it's been for a lot of people. Once it's established, good luck getting rid of it. This person who actually explained it this way to me, at the time was working for APSI as a rep. He's no longer with them, but he was explaining to the ward what guardianship actually was. And again, it really stuck with me. I think it's useful for moving forward here. So let's look a little bit at this analogy of a tattoo. Let's say that you, or maybe you have kids, want to get a tattoo, or your kid comes to you and says, hey, I want to get a tattoo. What more would you want to know, or what questions would you have before just kind of jumping right into, yeah, go ahead and get it?
Where are you getting it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are you out of your mind?
Sure.
Who's going
What
to
else
give
would
it
you
to
want?
you?
What's that?
Who's going to give it to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you trust the person that's going to do this, right?
Is it going to be somewhere that's not going to affect your job?
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Yeah.
not visible when not needed.
Right.
Why
Because
are you getting it?
why? What's the reason behind it? Is this some sort of expression? Are you trying to fit in with some other people who have tattoos? There are a lot of questions that we would start asking, right? Why? Because this is permanent. So before we jump to something so permanent, we rightfully start asking some questions about that measure. So now think about actually moving forward with a tattoo. What are some other things that we could try before getting a permanent tattoo to see if maybe it was the right thing to do?
Requesting a sketch of the tattoo?
Yeah, I want to know what this is going to look like for real. I'll tell you a quick story. When I got my first tattoo, I went in to look at the sketch, and it's a ship, but they had just drawn a couple of shapes, and I did not trust that sketch because that is not what I wanted on my body. So I went somewhere else. But yeah, good point. What else might we try before actually getting the permanent tattoo?
There's also, I think it depends on the shop. I think some people will offer a sort of temporary tattoo of sorts.
Yeah, for sure. Temporary tattoos, henna tattoos. They even have apps now where you can draw the picture, find the picture yourself, and it will show you what it looks like on your skin before you get it. And the point of all of this is, again, before we jump to something so permanent, there are a lot of other things that we can try, right? So they have actually held hearings on self-determination and guardianship. And I'm not going to read the entire slide to you, but suffice it to say that the chairman of these hearings summarized it this way, basically saying that the typical ward, the typical person under guardianship has fewer rights than the typical convicted felon. So someone else is choosing where they're going to live, what medical treatment they're going to get, or if they get that treatment, where they're going to work. And in more extreme cases, when and how they might die. So right before I took this job with ONI, Ohio Network for Innovation, There was someone I had worked with as an SSA for years who just had a stroke, and he ended up in the hospital with very little, if any, brain functioning.
Oh.
To meet him and just kind of, say my last goodbyes to him. And when I arrived, the nurses were tending to him behind the curtains, so I waited. And all I could think was that this guy should be flirting with those nurses, finding some way to have them bring him a can of pop, cracking jokes, and none of that was happening. This is not the way that this man would have wanted to live. I talked to his SSA at the time about it, and she said something that really struck me. She said, this guy's life was very difficult. His death shouldn't have to be that difficult. And, APSI was his rep, and nothing against APSI. They were doing the best they could, and they have rules they have to follow, precautions they have to take. But, he remained in that hospital for a couple of weeks like that before APSI was ready to make the decision about how and when he was going to die. So when it comes to matters of guardianship, there are a lot of rules that govern, again, probate court and guardianship. And the Ohio Attorney General provides training on this as well. And the one thing that is very clear in the training and the rules is that guardianship is an extreme measure, and it should only be pursued as a last resort. That's the guidance given to probate court judges as well. Now, again, doesn't mean that's how it's practiced, but that's what's in the rule. So there are two criteria that have to be met in order for someone to be appointed a legal guardian. First, that person has to lack capacity to make decisions. Now, a really important point here, that does not say that they have to lack capacity to make good decisions. This isn't about judging whether or not they're making good or bad decisions. This is just about the ability to make decisions. Can you understand information and situations presented to you, process that information in some way, and then make a decision about it? So that's what capacity is all about. And then two, there have to be no less restrictive alternatives available. When we were talking about the tattoo, have we tried all these other things first before we went to guardianship? So we're going to talk a little bit about this. Every local probate court kind of does this differently, but the rules are the same for each of them. The kind of guardianship that we're probably most familiar with is that full guardianship, but there are actually a lot of different kinds of guardianship that can be awarded. Limited guardianship is certainly an option for people, and we'll touch on that in a little bit here. So let's talk a little bit about capacity, but we're going to start with talking about what capacity is not. Capacity is not someone's IQ. Just because they have a certain IQ or their IQ score falls within a certain range does not mean that they lack capacity or that they need a guardian. It's also not universal. So, everyone with autism does not need a guardian. Everyone with Down syndrome does not need a guardian. But it's also not easy to assess or to measure. And, we can think about ourselves, our coworkers, our friends, when we dive a little deeper into this. We all probably need help with some decisions in different situations, right? And the help that we need might look different as well. For example, I need a little bit of help with my finances, especially the more complicated stuff. Now, that doesn't mean I need a guardian. That doesn't mean that I lack capacity to make decisions, in every area of my life. It just means I could use a little help with my finances, right? All right, capacity is very individualized. So for each of us, that's gonna look different, and it's situational. So maybe think about this, are there times, situations in which you have more difficulty making decisions than others? Can anybody think of an example where maybe you're flustered or you just have more difficulty making a decision?
I think if you're put on the spot and you don't have time to really think about something before you have to make a decision that really affects your ability, you can become flustered and you're just not able to think through the process.
Yeah, definitely. When we're under pressure of some kind, we feel like somebody needs an answer, or maybe we don't know who to ask for that help. My best example is, for me, certain times of day do not work. From about 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., I should not order anything off of Amazon. Because at the time, it seems like a great idea. I need this thing. And then the next morning when I get that email telling me that it has shipped or whatever, I realize, ooh, I probably should have talked this through or held off on this, right? But that doesn't mean that I don't have the capacity to make decisions. It means that there are certain circumstances under which I maybe don't make great decisions, or I could use a little bit of help with that, right? So capacity can change based on experience and situation. It can change based on the kind of support given. And then a lack of opportunity to practice decision-making can actually prevent people from developing capacity. So if they just don't have the chance to try this out, how are they ever going to develop that capacity to make decisions? All right, so how about those less restrictive alternatives? Alternatives. You've probably heard of some of these. We're not going to talk in depth about most of them, but I want you to see them. So power of attorney, when you do have capacity to make decisions, deciding that at some future point and for some specific situations, someone else can make those decisions for you. Supported decision making, which we're going to touch on here in a little bit. A payee. Now, the interesting thing about a payee is that's appointed by Social Security, but that payee really only has authority over that benefit money. And so often we see paychecks being kind of funneled to the payee. Now that may be necessary, to supplement their benefit money with their paychecks in order to cover their living expenses. But the payee doesn't automatically have authority over those paychecks. It has to be voluntary. Peer support, just going to people we know, our friends, for help. Special needs trust. So, you have an excess of money, but you want to protect your benefits, you can put it in a trust. Assistive technology. There are so many apps out there right now with this. If you are using remote supports can really be used to help people make decisions with specific things if they need it as well. They can touch a button, they can get in contact with somebody who can kind of talk them through things, rather than needing someone to be there all the time for them, because sometimes they need help to make decisions. One of the apps that I talk about when I do this presentation is called Be My Eyes. And if you're not familiar with it, it's an app similar to Uber in some ways, where you have a pool of people who need something and a pool of people who are willing to help with that thing. In this case, it's people with low vision or blindness who need help from someone to make sense of their surroundings or read something. So in their marketing videos, they show someone open the refrigerator who really can't read the print on a box about the expiration date, or maybe it's milk. And so they use this app. They just touch a button, it connects with someone who can then see through the camera on their tablet or their phone, and that person can read to them the expiration dates and be like, no, man, that's got to go in the trash. That's too old. But that right behind it, you can definitely use. So just another example of how we can use technology for that. Alexa, those in-home technological assistants, those are becoming bigger and bigger for people too, to just get help. Life coaching, so teaching people how to make decisions, helping people make progress towards the life they want. And in limited guardianship, where a probate court would award guardianship, but only for specific things. So we're going to talk what supported decision-making is now. First thing we're going to do is watch this video. It's very short, but does a good job of telling one person's story about moving in the direction of a less restrictive alternative to guardianship. So if you can't hear the audio, please chime in and let me know.
Our top story this half hour is one we should all take to heart. It is about a young woman with a disability who decided to take control of her life and did so despite opposition from her own family.
In the process, she blazed a trail for others facing similar challenges. Her name is Jenny Hatch, and Don Daler has her story so far.
Jenny Hatch has worked at this Virginia thrift store for more than 6 years.
I love my thrift store.
The 29-year-old is meticulous, making sure the shelves stay organized and the merchandise fashionable.
So the pink is done now.
She even runs the register.
75. I don't like.
The store owners, Kelly Morris and Jim Talbert, have long been Jenny's friends. Now they are also her guardians, the result of a landmark legal battle for her independence.
I'm so much happy that I live here now. Because now I decided to come home and spend time with my friends.
Hatch, who has Down syndrome, wanted to live with Morris and Talbert. Her mother and stepfather wanted her to live in a group home. The case went to court. Jenny won. Attorney Jonathan Martinez.
We had to change long-held, ingrained beliefs about what people with disabilities can and can't do.
The judge granted Morris and Talbert temporary limited guardianship over Hatch until August 2014. After that, it's up to her.
I don't think Jenny needs a guardian for everything in this world. I think, to quote Jenny, she just needs a little help.
Since her court victory, Hatch has become an icon for the developmentally disabled. In October, she also became the face of a foundation, the Jenny Hatch Justice Project. D.C. native Ryan King is their first client.
Everybody needs a little hope every now and then, but once you're independent, I think you're good to go.
When King turned 18, his family became his legal guardians. But his mother, Susie, says her son doesn't need that level of supervision, so they've taken their case to court.
We followed Jenny's story, and we decided, well, why not try it ourselves? We tried it before. Even though we were turned down, we decided to try it again.
When her guardianship expires next year, Hatch is still deciding what to do. Power of attorney, guardian, or neither. She's won the right to choose.
And I'm here to spread the message with disabilities. I'm taking over.
In the meantime, Hatch says she'll continue to get by with a little help from her friends. For CBS This Morning Saturday, Don Daler, New York.
She's very cool.
It is, and it takes one case to set a precedent.
Yeah,
So hopefully this changes things.
Look at what she's done.
So Jenny's case really was a landmark case, and it helped kind of set the precedent for this movement that has gained a ton of momentum, both in our country and internationally. I want to pick up really quickly on what that mom said in the video, though, when she talked about her son just not needing that level of supervision. So, every SSA in every county is kind of in a different place here, but I know when I was an SSA and an SSA supervisor, we talked a lot about supervision and just trying to stay away from a heavy-handed approach to that. So, for example, if someone does have a risk related to cooking, occasionally when they cook, they have had a fire because they forget to tend to the thing on the stove. Well, saying that that person needs visual supervision at all times is a very heavy-handed, broad, general approach to that, right? And the same would be true for guardianship. Just because the person needs help with one or two things doesn't mean they need a guardian to make all decisions in their life for them. So this supported decision-making thing has a lot of support, like I said. It's actually been promoted by the American Bar Association, National Guardianship Association, a number of other big name agencies like Department of Education, Health and Human Services, National Council on Disability, and DRO, Disability Rights Ohio, has actually made this a priority for them in 2020. So what is supported decision making? Another question for all of you, just quickly. When you look at this slide, do any of those situations look familiar? Or what do you think is going on in those pictures? How about this one up in the upper right? That's looks like a couple of people looking at something online, right? Things that we all probably do at some point. This one in the middle, family members talking about something, right? So these are all things that we do naturally. So what is supported decision making? Jonathan Martinez, that lawyer in the Jenny Hatch video, says it's not one size fits all, but it's basically when people choose trusted people around them to help them understand situations and the choices that they face so they can make their own decisions. And he goes on to say that this can be more or less formal. The support can look a lot of different ways. but all supported decision-making agreements share these three common elements. First of all, we have to recognize that this person has the right to make his or her own decisions. And number two, that entering into a supported decision-making agreement doesn't mean that they're surrendering their right to make the decision. It just means they're asking for some help. And then three, that this person's support may need to look a lot of different ways depending on who it is, depending on the situation. So kind of at the core of supported decision-making is this really important idea that decision-making is a skill that can be learned. And we know that there's no such thing as, a mistake-proof or risk-free life. Risk is inherent in life. So this is very much about dignity of risk, respecting that, taking those risks that help us live a full life and learn about life. So there's that dignity that is respected in supported decision-making. So we're going to revisit this just for a second. If making bad decisions was a criteria for having a legal guardian, who would have a legal guardian? Pretty much everybody, right? So, I used to ask this question, can you think of a decision that you've made in the past that didn't work out so well? And I stopped asking people to share those with us. But also, have you ever thought about a decision you made that maybe didn't have the support of the people around you, but it ended up working out anyway? And very early on when I asked this question, someone said, I wanted to move to Cleveland, and my mother was not in support of it, but I moved anyway, and it's where I ended up meeting my husband. So from her perspective, that worked out in the end. Give me 1 second, my dog is whining at my feet. He wants to jump up on my lap. Okay, thank you. All right. So what do we know about self-determination in general? Well, we know that there are a lot of studies out there that say that people who exercise more self-determination, have a greater independent living score. They live more independently. Greater financial independence, and better jobs, better employment outcomes in general, especially after high school. So what are the roles in supported decision-making? Well, you've got that decision maker, right? And then you've got the supporters around them. So the decision maker is going to choose the people to be the supporters. No one else makes this decision for them. They get to decide that. This can be family members, neighbors, friends, advocates, church members. As long as there's no clear conflict of interest, they can choose whomever they want to be a supporter for them. Now, we know that not everybody that we work with has a big pool of people to choose from, right? So it's so critical that we continue to keep trying to help people build meaningful relationships in their lives so that that pool is bigger for them. They also get to decide what kind of decisions to get help with. So a couple of examples. Let's say that somebody on a day-to-day basis is perfectly fine managing their money, paying for their day-to-day expenses. But then they get a lump sum that they have to spend down, $4,000 or $5,000, $6,000 or more. Well, they need help with that. That doesn't mean they need a guardian, right? It just means they need help in that particular situation. Or how about housing? We see this a lot when people move from a more institutional setting to a more community-based one. Maybe it's the first experience that they've had of maybe having their own bedroom. So they walk into a house, they see they're going to have their own bedroom, and they're ready to sign. And maybe they need some help to consider things like the safety of the neighborhood and whether or not it is affordable or close to things that they want to have access to, right? Or even down the road, who's going to make a good roommate for someone? I could use some help with that sometimes in my life as well. And in healthcare, your doctor ever tell you something that you didn't completely understand? And you wanted him to say it another way to you? Yeah, they can get help with that sort of thing too. And these are not the only life areas. Think about, relationships or education or sex. The other thing is that people can choose who they want to help with these things. It can be a different person for each area of life. You know, I may want mom to help me with money. When it comes to relationships and sex, mom is not the person I'm choosing to help me with those decisions. I got somebody else for that, right? And they get to decide what the help actually looks like. So for some people, this is a pros and cons list. Maybe you're going to do that online research to learn more about this, or role play through it to kind of understand the situation better. So, you know, think about it this way. If you remember that show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You know, people had those lifelines available to them. They didn't necessarily need help with every question, but when they ran into a difficult one, they could reach out for help. They could phone a friend, or they could poll the audience, right? And in those situations, that help, that support kind of popped in, provided support, and then popped back out, leaving the person to make their own decision. So think of supported decision-making that way. And finally, and probably most importantly, the decision maker makes the decision. Again, nothing about a supported decision-making agreement or arrangement or relationship takes away that right of the person to make their decision. And not to undersell this slide is a little bit short, but the supporters, they need to be willing and able to fulfill the role of the support. They need to understand what's being asked of them and know that they can be there in those situations. And then they have to support that person to make their own decision. This is not about getting the person to make the decision that you want them to make, right? It's about helping them understand it so they can make their own decision. So one of the more formal ways to kind of honor a supported decision-making relationship is with a supported decision-making agreement. It is not the only way, but it is one of the more popular ways. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that is. But it's going to document the important details that we just kind of talked about. Who the supporters are, where the person wants support, things like that. Now, using a supported decision-making agreement does not trump guardianship. If guardianship is already in place, the supported decision-making agreement can't take the place of that. But it can be used in conjunction with a lot of other things. You know, it can be used in conjunction with a power of attorney. It can be used in conjunction with technology, life coaching, counseling, a payee, all those other things. So what might it look like? Maybe something like this. You've got that initial page. It just says, hey, what's this all about? Who's it for? What's the nature of this agreement? You got another page where we identify the supporters. Who's going to help me? How do I get a hold of them when I need help? Where and when do I want that help? And when do I not want that help? Yeah, please help me with my money. I'll ask you when I need that help. But you know what? Stay out of my housing business. That's for me to decide. And then important signatures to kind of make this thing legit. So I threw this in at the end. It is a life trajectory, if you're familiar with that person-centered tool, but used for supported decision-making. And if you can kind of see at the bottom left, that blue dot that says start early and create experiences for decision-making. You remember how employment has changed over the past several years? It used to be that, you know, people came out of school, they got funneled into their sheltered workshop because that's what was available and that was the expectation. And then slowly we started introducing other options, especially early on, helping people gain skills and experience so that when they left school, they weren't looking for which sheltered workshop to go to. They were looking for, what are my other opportunities here? Well, the same is true for guardianship. The number of times that, you know, we've heard from parents who said, well, I was told I have to get guardianship when they turn 18, right? So just kind of by default, they've applied for guardianship for people. And what we say about guardianship, a little bit like a tattoo, right? Once you have it, it's kind of difficult to get rid of. So helping parents and people with disabilities understand there are a lot of other options. In fact, guardianship should be a last resort. So, the choices. If this is true, that we are our choices, they make us who we are, then what does that make someone who doesn't have the right to make their own choices? And wouldn't it be better to support people in other ways to kind of exercise or develop that skill before we take that right away. And that's really what supported decision making offers. It's respect to that person's dignity and basic civil rights to make choices about their life. We do know that implementing supported decision making is a process. It does not happen overnight. A lot of this has to do with education and awareness, before we start identifying specific situations where we can jump in. But that's why we thought it was important to take this time to talk to everyone about it and kind of get some feedback. So with that, what questions, comments, or feedback do you have about supported decision making?
I guess it's more of a comment. I know that working with families, and I used to work specifically with transition, and the level of fear that the parents have. They're turning 18, something bad can happen to them. And I have a son with a disability as well, and so hearing their, it's not just professional, it's personal, and my comment to them is just because a person has a guardianship, kind of like your tattoo example, is that there's not necessarily a tattoo on, there's nothing that shows anybody else, a medical provider, a loan officer, and anybody, that a person has has a guardianship and why. No one knows that. It just simply helps you unravel things if things go wrong. But it does, what I mean? It changes really so little, but yet so much, all at the same time. So helping people think through the process, I can't tell you how many times there was I didn't realize that. I mean, I don't know what people thought, that there was some database of, people with, guardianships, and that, loan officers and stuff will look through that, and see, make it, use that as a determining factor, but that's not the case. So I think a lot of people were, are surprised by what guardianship is and what it isn't, and what it can and what it can't do, and what kind of so-called protections are there. A guardianship doesn't protect a person from making a bad choice. It just doesn't, in a day-to-day sort of way.
You are so right. And I think education and awareness is key to this. It's very foundational. I didn't share it in this presentation, but there's data that says that people with greater self-determination are actually as safe, if not safer, than people with guardians. There has never been a study produced, at least that I'm aware of, that suggests that someone with a guardian is safer than someone without. And there's a ton of data to support it. So sometimes it's about sharing that information, right? Sharing personal experiences. Again, the number of times that I worked with someone who had a parent as a guardian from the time that they came out of school until that parent passed away. And maybe that parent passes away when the ward is 40, 50, 60 years old. Well, now they're 40, 50, 60 years old with almost no experience in some cases, making their own decisions. Now what do we do? Now do we find an absentee guardian? The point is that there are a lot of options that we can talk about, and there are a lot of fears we need to address, and we need to have very honest conversations about what those fears are, and then try to help people understand all of the resources available to help people both feel safe but also be happy in their lives. What else? What other questions or comments do you have?
How would you suggest people find those relationships that can help them with supported decision making? Because I find that a lot of times the people that I support and provide services supports to, they might not necessarily have a guardian, but there's always been somebody who has made the decision for them in a way, or they've always looked to somebody to make the decision, whether it be like a parent and then like an ISC or SSA or a provider or something like that. And so they haven't learned to decipher opinions and guidance. And so when they meet with people or a certain, what they would say a support group, it's not always the best support. And so I guess like, how can you help people engage in the community in a more, I don't know if that's going to be like, I don't know if you can really have an answer, but I think that that's what, in my experience, that's what I've struggled with. It's not necessarily like the service supports that they have, those are good, but it's more those like actual natural supports or friends or family or whatever that are because they can't understand or don't, or haven't learned, like, this is not a good decision, I'm going to listen to them. I don't know if you have an answer.
Yeah, no, I think you're getting at the crux of what we're trying to do in working with your county and other counties across the state is, how do we actually do this? You know, sounds great, how do we do it though? So there is a more protracted approach, which is continuing to work on, you know, real relationships and inclusion, but you know, that doesn't mean we're going to be relationships yet. So to be perfectly candid with you, what we've heard from some other counties, and I don't know that this is the direction we'll go, but it's certainly been a request, is in lieu of those sort of naturally occurring relationships at this stage, is there a way to create a board of some sort, a panel of people who can serve as supporters for people that we can draw upon? You know, they would obviously need to develop rapport, but they would be a little more objective, maybe. So we are getting requests for something like that. Will that happen? I don't know yet, but that's certainly out there. And then a couple other things. I guess I never want to come across as suggesting that guardianship is not appropriate for anyone. Guardianship is appropriate for some people. You know, if they do lack the capacity to make decisions and there are no other less restrictive alternatives available, and that's what guardianship is for. You know, but we might be able to address some of these things with a power of attorney as well. But the other thing I would say is we may have to introduce this to some of those teams. If you already do have a person who's a part of that team who kind of de facto is making decisions for that person, just throw it out there, some of these sort of guidelines for supported decision making, and say, hey, why don't we try it this way this time? And, you know, maybe start with smaller decisions and just see how that goes, and then get back with the team and say, did that work? You know, it's the old working, not working. What worked and what didn't about this? And then let's try it again next time. So there is no one easy answer, but all of those things in conjunction, I think, make up the path forward for us. Does anybody else have thoughts or ideas though? Go ahead.
One thing that, you know, I think as we're looking to build, quote, teams, one of the barriers that I see is that people, number one, are afraid to be a member of the team, about commitment and liability that might be there. And I think they feel as though that it's, you know, a more permanent situation. How many of us consult with people that we, number one, barely know, and number two, you know, come in and out of our lives? So I think that's, you know, as we're trying to pull people in to make decisions, you know, it may be just for one meeting, or it may be in one, you know, one context, you know, one setting. It's not like they're committing to, you know, being part of this person's life forever, or, you know, that they're going to be called upon every time this person has, you know, a big decision to make. You know, the people that I ask for advice on health might be not the same people that I'm going to ask for advice on finances, for instance, you know. So, and other people, I just need, you know, an ear to bounce off of, you know, to talk with, you know, to, you know, especially as, you know, they say, you know, some people just talk in circles until they come to a decision, and they need somebody there to listen. And sometimes that's all you need, you know. So, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's important for us to be clear with the expectation that we have of the person that we're asking to be a member of the team.
100% agree. This is bidirectional, a voluntary relationship. So that supporter has to understand and agree. And if at some point that supporter doesn't, they opt out of that relationship. And the same for the decision maker. Let's say they don't like the advice they're getting from their supporter. They can say, yeah, I don't want you to help me anymore. So it is voluntary, which makes it maybe a little more fragile, but more real. Like you were just saying, the people that we consult in our lives, yeah, I have some people in my life that have been in my life for most of it that I go to. And then I have other people in my life that I know through a friend of a friend, but they have a particular expertise in a subject. So I'm going to go to them because I trust my friend who trusts them, So those relationships can look all of those ways. And it's about us helping people explore the dimensions. We talk about the 6 degrees of separation. Who do we know that knows somebody? Who does Fairfield County know that might be a resident expert in something that could fill in a gap here? Or who do you know personally that has expertise in a subject that might be willing to just get us started with one of these things? We're going to have to strike out and try some different things and see what works and what doesn't. But I think you made a great point about the relationships.
Yeah, and I just wanted to just talk real quick, because I think that's something that, we as, we're working with Josh and everything that, and even as a conversation that we had as supervisors, that's something that we've identified, like, especially if, bringing in people that have the best interests of the individual involved, and sometimes I think that we struggle, we have that, in our teams at times, that does that person who's helping to support that person with making decisions have the best interests, and how do we kind of help that person, through that process and everything else. So I think that's going to be something that, as we kind of bring together this committee or this group to kind of identify what that looks like. So thank you, Marie, and for Charity for bringing that up.
And just to piggyback on that, David, I think on the other end of that spectrum, we look at people who are really having good intentions of being good supports, but at the end of the day, really it should be about the individual and what they really want. And sometimes the supports just want to be so protective of things, they often forget that, the ultimate decision should be made by that individual, and they should have most of the say of what really they want in their life. And it's just a good managing that balance of having supports, but still giving them, the individual, the empowerment to still have that say. I think that's a big challenge as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it goes back to Josh's point, and I think even Scott commented, because we have Scott Campbell with us too, that dignity of risk. And, people are allowed, like you and I, we all make bad decisions. We've made bad decisions. Now, those decisions that we've made that maybe were bad in the past have actually helped us to make maybe better decisions. So we've had to make some of those good decisions. So yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that self-determination point, that person, and again, that has to come together as that team to understand that person has that final say in that decision, good, bad, or indifferent. So yeah, I think that's very well taken.
So that education and awareness piece is key. And I think while a formal supported decision-making agreement on paper is one option, it's not the only option. But some of the formal paper supported decision-making agreements can be recognized by courts as well. So, one supported decision-making agreement is going to look different from another, but it's a great way to document that, hey, this is actually the purpose of it. If you have a supporter that maybe is acting in their own interest, you bring them right back to that agreement. It's a binding agreement, So there are a lot of ways we can do this, but we're going to have to use the resources that we have at first. And that might cause us to ask the question, is it going to be better to have someone who doesn't know the person very well, but is objective in trying to act in their best interest? Or is it better to have someone who knows the person really well, but maybe isn't acting in that person's best interest at first? That may be a question we're faced with when we start to get this off the ground.
I was going to comment on something in that regard, in that it's almost like there needs to be a balance. There's got to be, at least in the member of the team, a couple people that really doesn't know the person, who's objective, who doesn't have, perhaps some of the personal entanglements, that creates a situation where we become paralyzed out of concern, or out of, just our own continuum of risk taking, you know, and impose that on somebody else, someone outside. I think back to, you know, my years of child welfare, and we talk about how, you know, there are people who can be assigned to come in and act as, you know, guardian of that item, or people that, you know, came in and set in on IEPs who weren't known to the person, but were there simply to make sure that the process goes well, and that, you know, their eyes and ears are to ensure that this team is really allowing them to have as much say as they should have. And I think, you know, developing people who have, you know, just, you know, perhaps that we give some training to, perhaps that we, you know, a pool of people who can set in from time to time on these, you know, in these team meetings, you know, that can be that unbiased person. It would be a good idea, provide some good balance.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I had another thought and then I lost it. So
I have found that the teams that we have in place can be very helpful for the person. If the ISC gets together with the provider, OOD might be involved in some respects, and the vendor might be involved in some respects. I think that they offer a lot of support, but sometimes it's such a long-term learning situation for that person, because their behaviors are what they are, and they've come up a certain way, and this is how they think, and it's going to be very hard to change that way of thinking. And sometimes we bring the counselor situation into it, but yeah, I find it, I mean, we can't infringe on their rights, even though we might think their decisions aren't necessarily the greatest.
Yeah, I think that brings it, you know, kind of talking about, you know, bringing all those players into that person's team to, you know, really kind of hone in on, you know, how do we best support that person. So, you know, it could be different agencies, it could be different, you know, medical people, to bring that in and help them kind of make those choices. And I think it does come down to, you know, as a team being centered, helping that person understand, you know, what kind of decisions they're making, kind of what are the, you know, impacts of that decision, good and bad. So I think those are all good points right there too, Kathy.
Yeah, I also think that they have to be on the same page too, because if you're not on the same page with things, then it probably won't work out to the best, because there could be manipulation, or, well, they said this, she said this, whatever. The problem I have a lot of times is the permission kind of to make a choice. Like, yeah, you're allowed, yeah, what? I can make a choice? Yes, you can make a choice. Then also the permission to make a bad choice, but not only make a bad choice, but to learn from that bad choice. I find that I get parents or guardians who are like, not necessarily afraid, but just like want to protect them from the repercussions of that bad choice or that experience, not necessarily bad, but that experience. And then like any learning that could have happened in that event or adjustment with the support of the team just kind of goes by the wayside. So is that something that you guys have talked about, or have people discussed, or you've experienced in your, as you've been working on this, like when there has been a bad decision made or an adversity situation made, how has the team supported the person in going through the implications of that versus let's make an excuse, let's protect, does that make sense? Like, yeah. I'm just kind of curious if anybody has kind of gone through that and shared that with you before, of how they kind of helped that.
So a few different things. I'm going to try to remember all of them. If you are not familiar with the Happy Safe grid, it's not one of the more used tools in our system, but I used it as a supervisor a lot, and it was fantastic. It's just a 4-quadrant grid where you plot each option that you were considering with a person as to how happy it will make them and how safe they will be if they do it. And you can do it on a whiteboard, you can do it on chart paper, whatever, but it allows everyone visually to see, oh, well, if we do this, he's going to be super happy, but maybe not completely safe. But if we do this, he's going to be completely safe and miserable, right? And so when you get all those things plotted and people can see it, it seems to have more of an impact. The other thing I would share is that this is long-term. I worked with a young man as an SSA. I worked with him for 9 years. So very briefly, he did not have control over his limbs. And when he was not restrained, he would hurt himself. And he wanted to go skydiving. And, whether or not you have a disability, if you want to go skydiving, there are some potential consequences, some risk with that, right? Dad initially said, no way, it's just not happening. We had this conversation for 3 years, and the guy just kept bringing it up. Well, when can I go skydiving? How can I go skydiving? And we just started to shift the question that we were asking, because it was less about can I go skydiving and more about how can we make this happen? Because if we said, can I go skydiving? The easy answer was no. Conversation over. But if we said, okay, I get that you're scared, but let's entertain the idea. How could we make this happen and keep it safe? And over 3 years, we got to one meeting where this guy was in a meeting with us, ended up having to go to the bathroom. So his staff took him to the bathroom, and I sat with mom and dad, and they looked at me and they said, you know what, we ride motorcycles. And if anybody told us that we couldn't ride motorcycles anymore because it was dangerous, we'd laugh at them and tell them to go to hell. Sorry, but that's what they said. And after 3 years, they said, I think I get why he wants to go skydiving. So let's figure this out. I became a supervisor, but the next SSA found a place in Chicago, an indoor skydiving place. We have video of it, where they took him in. He got to float up with 2 people floating with him and have the skydiving experience, right? But we plotted that on a happy, safe grid. Yes, he got to have the experience. It wasn't jumping out of a plane, but he got to have the experience. So a lot of that creative thinking, brainstorming with the help of maybe somebody from outside to consider those options. And then to your point about, well, let's say they make a decision that doesn't work out, right? Just reminding people that we all do that, but also it's really important if we know what the goal is in mind ahead of time. If you're using even a life trajectory, what was the goal? Where does this person want to get? How does this bad decision impact that? Because if it's just a bad decision that you and I wouldn't have made, but it doesn't actually impact or prohibit them from making progress towards their goal, then okay. So bringing it back to the big picture perspective, let's zoom out, look at what they really want to have happen in their life and how this decision fits in with the rest of that.
I like one of the things that you said about, whether or not, a decision makes you happy or sad. One of I think the biggest barriers we have with people making, people that we serve, making decisions for themselves to begin with is that we start out with school. And, for those who are, serving young children, I think it starts then. We make them prompt dependent, number one, where they lose the capacity. We take away the capacity then for them to make decisions because we're constantly telling them when they can do things, what they can do, how they should stand, what they should think. It starts very young. It's almost like we groom individuals with disabilities into becoming more dependent. And then they reach adulthood, and magically we expect, to be able to make some decisions. Well, right about then, they're realizing that, I've lived a life where I've told what to do forever. And, some people become pretty angry about that. And then we see behaviors starting. And then, then we're like, oh, we gotta save the world from all these bad behaviors, that we've really created, So, I think, I think there's a couple categories of folks. There's those that rebelled for the sake of rebelling because I'm tired of conforming all the time. So I'm always going to rebel. And then there's the people who have succumbed, who have capitulated and just rolled over and said, you know what, I don't know how to make any decisions for myself anyway. So I'm not going to make any more decisions. I'm going to let you make the decisions because that's what I know. And somewhere in that, we have that continuum, going on there. And, and our folks, fall somewhere in that line. But in there, a lot of times what we find when we see, I know when we're doing ISP meetings, we ask questions and then they look to mom, or we ask questions and they look at dad, and they're looking at everybody else, but, really giving us an authentic, response. And because they're oftentimes, when you talk to folks, they're afraid of being bad. They're afraid of making mistakes. They're afraid of disappointing people, other people, not themselves, other people. So I think we have to, somehow, and it's so hard, to re-script us from putting that qualitative good, bad, label on things. If every decision I made was evaluated in good or bad, that would really stink. Marie, that's really a bad decision. You really should not have eaten that bagel because you don't eat it. It's not on your diet. If somebody was evaluating everything, every little decision that all of us made every day in good or bad, I don't know. I would probably eventually just say, okay, I must not know anything. I'm going to let somebody else. I need a dietitian to come in here and feed me. So I think it's such a shift in how we think. But it has to start young, and it's going to be harder for those folks who have come up, in a system that has, the premise that the system has is that you don't know, or you're incapable of deciding. And so it's going to take a lot of time to kind of reshape that. But it's exciting to hear that, I think putting things on paper gives people some sense of security, some sense of I've done my job, and I think makes people like us feel better, and hopefully results in a better outcome for people. I don't know.
Yeah, and instead of feedback on that, I have parents come to me with their adult child, and they say he needs to make their own decisions, and like you said, after years, 18, 20 years of not making their own decisions, and now the parents said, you have to do this, and they want to have just like that, just proof there is, well, no, you had to undo 18 years of not doing it, and they want it to happen in 2 months. It doesn't work that way.
I think that's a great point. It's like throwing them in the deep end, without any skills. And it is, I don't know if any of you know Dave Hingsberger from Open Future Learning. Look him up if you don't. He's incredible. His speeches, his videos, Dave Hingsberger. But he talks a lot about this. Like, our responsibility is to help people gain the skills to live the life they want. It is reckless of us to say, oh, this is the life you want? Well, here's all this opportunity, go do it. I don't know how to do it. Mm-hmm. Somebody has to help me learn how to do it. And the earlier we start, the better. But Marie and Scott, you make excellent points. This is comprehensive and systemic. So what's exciting is to hear that you're excited about this, and to know that this is one inroad into that. We start with supported decision making, and it can be potentially transformative for the system at large.
Yeah, and some of it is just the system in general. I mean, it's just if a regular person is graduating from high school and now they're allowed to make their own decisions, mm-hmm. They're also thrown into that world. So it's kind of just the way we have it set up for people. So it is a difficult, and especially for somebody that has been restricted. Like, I was thinking the same thing that Marie was talking about earlier. So yeah, there's a lot to be done. And the older people are even more used to being told what to do. Like, if they were in the workshops, for instance, it's hard for them to learn how to make decisions after 18, 20, or 40 years of listening to people tell them what to do.
Yeah, I think that's a great parallel into employment and talking about, how does somebody know what they want in employment if they've never been exposed to, what it is in order to have job skills or anything else like that. So yeah, I think it is kind of, and that's kind of why we want to kind of bring a group of people together to kind of talk about this a little bit further, and explore, what are our needs and how can we start, from, the kids' age to start, helping parents with developing, that decision-making ability for people and how we support them and everything else through those early childhood age up through transition and then into adulthood and everything, because, that's kind of where it starts. We need to start training, I think, parents, we need to start training school systems, and other agencies that we work with too, in order to kind of move this movement forward and everything too. So I think with that kind of being said, I know we're kind of approaching a little bit over an hour here. Does anybody have kind of any other questions or any other comments? I think at this point in time, I know I'm going to be working with Josh. We're going to schedule what I think he referred to as a discovery meeting. So if you're interested in being part of that, again, I'm kind of looking for at least one ISC from each team. I don't want it to get too big as well. So, but if you're interested, please, reach out to me and we'll kind of discuss that and everything. But I guess at this point, is there any other comments or any other questions or anything else?
Well, thank you so much for the conversation. Really enjoyed it. It's been great, and I am very excited to work with your county, given the feedback and enthusiasm. And seeing your faces briefly, that was nice too. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been a great conversation. I think, and I do appreciate everybody, hopping on here and everything and being a part of this. So again, if this is something that, definitely perks your interest and want to be involved in more of these conversations and how we kind of move forward, please reach out to me. And Josh, thank you for your time and thank you for meeting with us today.
Thank you. Hi, Lisa. I just saw your face. Well, thank you again, everybody. David will be in contact and we'll get this going.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Have a great day.
Yes, you too.